Now, to begin our sessions, I would like to welcome our opening session speaker, Kent Walker, President of Global Affairs for Google and Alphabet. Kent leads Alphabet's engagement with foreign governments and regulators, focusing on issues related to content policy and the intersection of technology and privacy. This session on how AI is transforming cybersecurity will be moderated by Chris Bracey, George Washington University Provost, Executive Vice President for Academic Affairs, and Professor of Law. We'll have 25 minutes for this session. A polite reminder that each of our sessions are part of a full day-long schedule, and our speakers are on a very tight schedule. So I request the audience to be seated before each session starts, as we will not have the flexibility for delayed starts later in the day. Thank you. Please welcome Kent Walker and Chris Bracey.
Thank you, Dean Mehrotra, and good morning, everyone. It's an honor to be joined here today by Kent Walker, who is at the forefront of the intersection of the internet and the law. He began as Vice President and General Counsel at Google in 2006 and later became Chief Legal Officer and now serves as President of Global Affairs at Google and Alphabet. In his illustrious career, Kent has had to navigate the complex patchwork of laws that exist around privacy and technology in countries across the globe. Kent's expertise will provide significant insight in our discussion today about these issues as it relates to artificial intelligence and cybersecurity. So let's dive right in. As we were chatting back in the green room, I mentioned that your job is really interesting because it combines so many different areas: the law, the policy, the technology. It's incredible the responsibility that you have, particularly today. So tell us all here, what are the top of mind issues for you at this very moment related to cybersecurity?
Well, thank you, Chris. Thank you for the introduction, and delighted to be here today. Cybersecurity has never been more important. As we live in an increasingly digitized world, cybersecurity needs to be built in the fabric of everything we are doing. So a lot of the issues we are looking at now, we've been working on for 10 years. I mean, Google has been one of the most secure platforms on the planet, but we're also one of the most attacked platforms on the planet. So balancing that and making sure that as we now turbocharge, as we move into this era of artificial intelligence, which will have significant advantages for a lot of the attackers, we want to make sure that the defenders have just as many advantages. We're seeing cybersecurity attacks going up something like 40% in the last year alone. So you're starting to see people exploit these new tools. That's a significant concern for any organization out there. And Google, both on our own services for consumers and Google Cloud, Google Public Sector, trying to make sure that the entire ecosystem raises up our game so that we move away from the notion of security products into the notion of secure products, where cybersecurity is built in by design from the get-go. That's a significant threat, but also a significant opportunity for all of us.
So Google has said previously and publicly that organizations need to approach AI boldly and responsibly. So what does that really mean in practice, though, Kent?
So the boldly part almost takes care of itself when you're dealing with a technology that's growing at such an exponential rate. There's twice as much compute being devoted to AI every 6 months as the 6 months before. That's 4 times faster than Moore's Law grew the capacity of chips. So we are seeing remarkable new capacities emerge, capabilities of tools that we didn't imagine even a few years ago. Now, you've been using AI for a dozen years. If you've used Google Search or email or Translate or Maps, it's been behind the scenes. But suddenly it's become much more visible with these chatbots and other sorts of tools, and AI goes well beyond chatbots. I think if you think this is just a chatbot issue, you are seriously misunderestimating the capability of AI. We're seeing remarkable advances. We talk about science at the speed of digital, and I'm happy to give some examples of that. But we have to pair that remarkable potential with an approach of responsibility as we launch. So as we're looking at the opportunity, we need to make sure that we're building in red teaming, adversarial reviews, safety that is built into the basic notion of the way the technology works. And that can be challenging when you're dealing with a technology that is operating at a level we've not seen before. But we have teams that are focused just on this notion of doing things responsibly. And in many cases, we've decided not to launch technologies or not to release them until we were satisfied that we had a framework in place that would actually protect people and society in a responsible way.
Well, let's educate the crowd a little bit, Kent. I mean, you said if you're thinking it's just ChatGPT or generative AI, you're missing the bigger picture. So tell us what really is the large-scale potential of AI, because it's said that AI will change everything. So what are the upside potentials of big achievements out there that we can
Yes, so we're seeing some remarkable things. Let me give you one example to start off with. Our team in London called DeepMind, recently integrated with Google Research, did something, well, I'll give you two examples. They started out with the notion of AlphaGo, which beat the world Go champion, which people thought wouldn't happen for another 10 years. And the way it did that was to study 100,000 human games and then play itself 3 million times, so a 30-to-1 ratio, and it got really, really good at Go. Within 6 weeks, the team said, okay, we have an algorithm that's not just good at Go, but good at game playing more generally. They repositioned the algorithm in 6 weeks to be really good at chess. The algorithm never having seen a single human chess game, then went on to beat the world computer chess champion decisively by playing itself 3 million times. That kind of self-learning capability, where the head of DeepMind, who is himself a chess master, said, in the morning, the machine was playing random moves on the board. By brunch, it was playing at my level. And by dinner time, it was playing better than any human being has ever played, and better than any other computer had ever played. That self-learning arc is remarkably powerful. So let me give you one tangible example of what that means. The team at DeepMind then turned the problem of protein folding. You all know that roughly 20 years ago, the human DNA was sequenced. Huge achievement, but not necessarily of all that much practical value, because you need to know not just what the DNA says, but how individual proteins are expressed or coded. We all know from COVID that if the spikes look like this, you need this kind of vaccine to come together. If the spikes look like this, you need a different kind of vaccine. Well, there are 200 million different proteins known to science. And it used to take multiple years, a doctoral thesis for a PhD biology grad student, to fold just one protein. AlphaFold folded 200 million of them in a year. So that saved 1 billion years of biology student PhD time. It's like taking every man, woman, and child in the United States, training them to be a biology PhD student, and having them do nothing else but fold proteins for several years. Imagine that kind of technology then applied to all sorts of other fields of human endeavor, nuclear fusion, clean water, and the like. It's an extraordinarily exciting time.
What about the risks, though, Kent?
So that's the balance part. That's the responsibility pair of bold and responsible, right? So we need to make sure that we are dealing with everyday problems that we know today, things like misinformation, disinformation. Will AI make it easier for the attackers to create deep fakes? We've seen examples of that already. Ukrainian President Zelensky had a deep fake where he was supposedly surrendering to the Russians. How do we use AI to detect that even faster than it can be created? But also hate speech, toxicity, privacy invasions, all of that class of problem. There's an important class of national security problems we need to be worrying about, because AI can also write code and identify flaws and vulnerabilities in existing code. So how do we ramp up on that side? And then how do we responsibly capture all the productivity, the innovation, and the like? So it's got to be a combination. No company, no group of companies on their own are going to be able to do this. That's not to say companies don't have responsibilities here. We do, and we take that very seriously. But I think it will also take the government coming together to help create frameworks around the international responsible use of these tools.
Oh, it's a remarkably brave new world that you're describing, Ken. Amazing things. But when it comes to AI, let's fold in cybersecurity here, right? What are the implications writ large for cybersecurity, given this new emerging environment of artificial intelligence?
So AI is remarkably good at identifying patterns and extrapolating from those patterns. And part of that is detecting anomalies in a system, things that don't look quite right. And you wonder why that was. It's like the janitor at the Watergate noticing that there's a little piece of tape on the door. I wonder why, right? So if you see, and if you use Gmail, you've seen this already for years, that if somebody, if you log in from San Francisco and then log in half an hour later from London, that's somewhat unusual, and maybe something is going on. So working through that set of tools to be able to identify problematic login attempts in Gmail, or websites that may have malware in them, or any one of the, I think we scan something like 10 billion different uploads, apps on the Play Store every day to detect malware or things that might be amiss. We also have a team called Virus Total that gathers abuse vectors, vulnerabilities, and exploits from around the world and shares them back out. So that's the sort of keeping our finger on the pulse of the cybersecurity attacks that are out there. And then our Mandiant team is also working on threat intelligence to try and figure out new attacks that are just emerging and trying to publicize those, because it is a collective effort, right? Any individual company, regardless of size, can't possibly keep track of all the different attacks out there. We need to find ways to work together to share what we're seeing so that we can all become stronger. It goes back to the first point, that in a world where the attackers are more sophisticated, more enabled by AI, et cetera, the defenders have to find strength in numbers, to pool resources to be able to make sure you're at the cutting edge of understanding vulnerabilities faster than the attackers can find them.
So when you think about all these cybersecurity threats, I mean, you have an incredible vantage point because you're able to sort of do an environmental scan in a way that laypersons like myself can't do. So, what are the biggest threats when it comes to cybersecurity today? I mean, you mentioned a handful of malware and this, that, and the other, but sort of if you had to rank your top 5, what are the biggest threats that sort of are out there for cybersecurity?
They come in different directions, right? They're the nation-state threat set of actors we're all familiar with. Increasing, you're seeing the commercially motivated actors, because the barrier to being a cyber attacker has come down. It's easier than it was years ago. You can get off-the-shelf tools to pull off a lot of these exploits. We also worry about next generation kinds of attacks. We talked a little bit about artificial intelligence powering some of this analysis. You can go to Bard or ChatGPT or your tool of choice and say, please analyze this code and tell me about vulnerabilities. Now that's different in degree, but not necessarily different in kind than code analysis tools and fuzzers and other sorts of tools that are out there now, but it makes it faster and easier than ever before. So we are trying to make sure we're dealing with a more sophisticated threat landscape. And then there's also the truly next generation work in quantum that's coming down the pike. We already have teams working on post-quantum cryptography. That's going to be necessary because quantum has the ability to undo the complex mathematics that are built into today's cryptography. And you worry about what's called hack now, decrypt later. Somebody goes out and grabs a lot of content now that's encrypted and waits for 5 or 10 years for quantum science, quantum computing to advance to the point where they can decrypt it then. And there are a lot of things that are secret today that you wouldn't want to disclose even 5 years down or 10 years down the pike. So our teams are already working on the era of post-quantum cryptography, coming up with keys that are robust against quantum attack, so we can gradually start to fold this into our security at Google and ultimately for everybody's security, to make sure that that threat, when it materializes, isn't as devastating as it otherwise could be. But again, it's got to be across the board. It can't be that individual actors out there, if you leave one door open and that door is into an organization that's trusted by other organizations, you're really only as strong as your weakest link. So we need to make sure that everybody gets on this train.
So these emerging technologies, AI and quantum computing, do they present more of a threat or a benefit to cybersecurity?
Well, I think at the end of the day, if we're responsible about it, if we're collective and lean into it, they should be a benefit. They make architectures more robust. They allow us to do reviews of coding and the like. And they're going to be essential. They're here. It almost doesn't matter what the answer to the question is. They're here whether we like it or not. So we have no choice but to make our own architectures as strong as they possibly can be. And I should say, again, the benefits are remarkable. Think of the quantum is as the head of our quantum team calls it, the language of nature. It's the way atoms talk to each other. And they're in a trillion different positions at the same time. And suddenly you're able to capture all of that complexity in a way we can't today. Imagine material science that in 10 or 20 years is as far advanced from today as we are from 100 years ago. That would be, again, that the list of phenomenal things that we'll be able to create is going to be remarkable. So we just need to make sure that we secure the digital infrastructure as we move down that path.
You mentioned earlier that the real advantage is that we can work as defenders, as collaborators, to figure out pathways to ensure that we are creating a very safe and secure environment. Collaboration is important. I'm a big fan of collaboration. I just wanted to ask you, how should government, industry, and institutions of higher education work together to advance artificial intelligence?
Let me start with the last of your three categories, institutions of higher education. Since we're here and we have students in the room, this has never been a more important field for smart, talented, energetic people to go into. There's an awful lot of new opportunity. We are really opening a new chapter in this book. So the chance for all of you to be thoughtful about how you're doing it and thinking about the next generation of work is going to be incredibly important. Now, we talked a little bit before about public-private partnerships. The quantum supremacy announcement we put out 2 years ago now was a public-private partnership, 3 years now, with the Department of Energy and NASA and the University of California at Santa Barbara and our quantum team. I joke that the coldest place in the universe is Santa Barbara, California, because you've got to keep those qubits really dark and really cold. But those kinds of pooled efforts are going to be essential for the progress we need to make. The size of the investment that's necessary, the fact that you need to get the best and the brightest from across a different variety of areas, and again, back to the responsibility conversation, the fact that you need frameworks to agree on standards and to disseminate information. Government has a really important role there.
So what are the most urgent areas, though? I mean, when you're thinking of corporate partnerships and engagement with academic research, what should we be exploring?
Focusing on the cybersecurity side of that question for a moment, because obviously there's going to be a lot of different potential for AI across the board. We're already seeing it in Silicon Valley, more PowerPoint presentations than you can imagine about AI for this, that, and the other thing.
Right.
But focusing on cyber, I would say trying to make sure that we have people who are technologically deep enough to understand the capabilities. That doesn't mean everybody has to be a computer science PhD. But you have to be able to speak the language of the computer science PhDs to understand the threat landscape that's evolving here. And so that mix between the PhDs in the room, and we've got, right now, Google, I think, has 13,000 computer science PhDs, more than any organization I know of. Taking that sheer horsepower and applying it to the real world practical problems of, I've got outdated legacy infrastructure from 1997, and I don't know all the bugs I've got. How do we upgrade that? How do we work on a program management structured way of just knocking down all the systems and upgrading to modern hybrid architecture based in the cloud, et cetera? Because it is, to Chris, your earlier point, it's really hard for individuals out there. If you're a system operator running a platform for 100 people, it's really hard for you individually to keep up with all the latest and greatest technology that's evolving or all the attacks that are out there. So we are encouraging people to move into more modern architecture, oftentimes with larger platforms that are customized for individual needs. And if we can do that, then I think we make the attack surface much harder for the bad guys who are out there, whether they're foreign state actors or financially motivated folks or ideologically motivated, or just malicious actors, script kiddies, they're sometimes called.
Do you think companies are investing enough in that sort of thing?
Overall, no, and it's understandable, right? It's the way that we don't invest enough in infrastructure writ large, because infrastructure isn't sexy until it is, something goes wrong, and people say, oh my God, why didn't we do X, Y, or Z? So the industry has understandably tended to be a little reactive. You wait for the latest attack, and then you respond, and then you upgrade. I think a lot of my message today is we can't really afford to sit back and wait for bad things to happen in this environment because the threat landscape is evolving so quickly. We need to get ahead. We need to be thoughtful and try and anticipate and stay at least one step ahead. And increasingly there are people out there who will partner with that and move the entire field forward. And that's, again, when we talk about public-private partnerships and frameworks. The government has, I think, this is an area where there is bipartisan agreement. We've tried to pull together with structures like the Enduring Security Framework and the like, where companies are sharing information about what they're seeing out there. So hopefully that progress benefits everybody.
And speaking of the government, right? I mean, we talk about the kinds of things that companies may want to do, and maybe companies should spend more time developing policies so that they can react more quickly to cybersecurity threats. But what advice would you give to government and policymakers who are trying to also move the needle from their perspective in their field?
You want to make this a safe space for companies. We as a company have taken a policy of trying to disclose attacks when we have them. We had a famous attack back in 2009, 2010 coming from China originally that led us to completely change our approach to cybersecurity. We went from what was called at the time crunchy on the outside to chewy in the middle, meaning once you got through the outside walls, it was fairly easy to access information internally, to something called zero trust security, where each node has to re-authenticate. But you have to make that really easy for folks so that there's one button you can touch on your computer to authenticate to move to the next level. Governments need to set an environment in which it's easy and for companies to report and be public about cyber attacks. At Google, we have a culture of blameless postmortem. What went wrong? Let's talk about it so we make sure it doesn't happen again. I think the government can play a big role in saying, look, bugs happen. They're inherent in the nature of software. It's less about finger pointing after the fact and more about how do we all learn from that and raise our collective level of readiness.
Now, when we think about government, we often think about our own government. But of course, when you're operating in a multinational environment, how does that increase the complexity in terms of making sure that policies are in place, making sure that the investments are attuned to the level of risk that's associated in a multinational environment?
One of the challenges you have as a multinational actor is different governments take different approaches to these issues. And we're trying to run the most efficient network we can around the world. That's harder if you have to localize your infrastructure and comply with a bunch of very different rules in different environments. It actually creates a lot of friction in the system and slows down the pace at which you can roll out cyber improvements and safeguards. So one of the things we advocate for in talking with governments around the world is to try and align internationally on frameworks and standards. And there are new standards evolving. The ISO 42001 standard for AI, for example, is a nice example of where the community has come together and tried to create a better sense of what does good look like, so that we're not having to chase one technological solution in France and another in Japan. That's inefficient for everybody. So the more we can bring people together and in alignment on this, the better we're all going to be.
I've got one final question for you, Ken. It's a question I often ask people because it's the kind of question that I get a lot as provost. When you're managing such a complex organization as you do, what keeps you up at night? What are the things that, because there are lots of issues out there, you're making lots of decisions, you're sort of eyeing, I said, the entire environment out there. You can do an environmental scan in a way that many people cannot. Yes. So what are the issues that keep you up at night?
Well, so Chris and I were talking in the green room before we came out about the range of different challenges we have. Content moderation is just one. We were saying, in Washington, half the people want us to take down more content from our services, half the people want us to take down less content from our services. So trying to make sure we're getting that right at a time of rising disinformation, misinformation, but also responsibility for free expression. That's a big area of focus. We're trying to work through a lot of the policy and regulatory issues around the world as Europe, for example, but other countries as well are enacting new laws and regulations to protect privacy, to protect kids, to safeguard users from consumer protection ways, et cetera. Again, trying to have alignment as we do that, because in many cases, these are very shared values, right? Everybody wants to protect kids, everybody wants to make sure that user information is private, but the actual implementation of that turns out to be quite challenging. And then, we talked a little bit about the cybersecurity risks. Those are always a challenge. We've been, so far, relatively lucky at Google not to have had major attacks, but you're only as good as your last attack, your last vulnerability. So we need to stay on the front foot there. But the other thing, and this is the other way of thinking about staying up at night, is the positive promise. What gets me up in the morning is the possibility of the remarkable way that we're going to be able to raise living standards around the world. Imagine if you could have, using these tools with quantum and material science or AI to understand new classes of problems. And that means you have clean drinking water for 1 billion more people around the planet. Or you can predict floods, as we're already doing in Pakistan and India, and protecting tens of millions of people from flood basins so that they can evacuate before floods come. Because the promise of AI, there's a line from Macbeth that I always like. Banquo goes to the witches and says to them, if you can look into the seeds of time and tell me which will grow and which will not, speak then to me. Well, that's what AI does. By having looked at 1 billion seeds, it knows which will grow and which will not. And we can use that incredible ability to predict the future to understand problems that still are on the edge of science. So I think we've talked about where are the big inventions, where are the great new developments of the last 10 or 20 years. I think we're just on the edge of seeing a whole new generation of dramatic scientific improvements. And that's a pretty exciting thing to get up to.
Well, thank you, Kent. This has been a wonderful conversation and an excellent kickoff to the forum. You described such an exciting world. We live in truly amazing times.
That's true.
Round of applause for Kent Walker, please.